Swedish Fairy Book. I KNœS. Once upon a time there was a poor widow who found an egg under a pile of brush as she was gathering kindlings in the forest. She took it and placed it under a goose, and when the goose had hatched it, a little boy slipped out of the shell. The widow had him baptized, KNœS, and such a lad was a rarity, for when no more than 5 years old he was grown, and taller than the tallest man. And he ate in proportion, for he would swallow a whole batch of bread at a single sitting, and at last the poor widow had to go to the commissioners for the relief of the poor in order to get food for him. But the town authorities said she must apprentice the boy at a trade, for he was big enough and strong enough to earn his own keep. So KNØS was apprenticed to a smith for 3 years. For his pay he asked a suit of clothes and a sword each year, a sword of 500 weights the first year, one of 1000 weights the second year, and one of 1500 weights the third year. But after he had been in the smithy only a few days, the smith was glad to give him all 3 suits and all 3 swords at once, for he smashed all his iron and steel to bits. KNØS received his suits and swords, went to a knight's estate, and hired himself out as a serving man. Once he was told to go to the forest to gather firewood with the rest of the men, but sat at the table eating long after the others had driven off. And when he had at last satisfied his hunger and was ready to start, he saw the 2 young oxen he was to drive waiting for him. But he let them stand and went into the forest, seized the 2 largest trees growing there, tore them out by the roots, took 1 tree under each arm, and carried them back to the estate. And he got there long before the rest, for they had to chop down the trees, saw them up, and load them on the carts. On the following day, KNØS had to thresh. First, he hunted up the largest stone he could find, and rolled it around on the grain, so that all the corn was loosened from the ears. Then he had to separate the grain from the chaff. So he made a hole in each side of the roof of the barn, and stood outside the barn and blew. And the chaff and straw flew out into the yard, and the corn remained lying in a heap on the floor. His master happened to come along, laid a ladder against the barn, climbed up and looked down into one of the holes. But KNØS was still blowing, and the wind caught his master, and he fell down and was nearly killed on the stone pavement of the court. "He's a dangerous fellow," thought his master. "It would be a good thing to be rid of him, otherwise he might do away with all of them. And besides, he ate, so that it was all one could do to keep him fed. So he called KNØS in and paid him his wages for the full year, on condition that he leave. KNØS agreed, but said he must first be decently provisioned for his journey. So he was allowed to go into the storehouse himself, and there he hoisted a flitch of bacon on each shoulder, slid a batch of bread under each arm, and took leave. But his master loosed the vicious bull on him. KNØS, however, grasped him by the horns and flung him over his shoulder, and thus he went off. Then he came to a thicket, where he slaughtered the bull, roasted him, and ate him together with a batch of bread. And when he had done this, he had about taken the edge off his hunger. Then he came to the king's court, where great sorrow reigned, because once upon a time, when the king was sailing out at sea, a sea troll had called up a terrible tempest, so that the ship was about to sink. In order to escape with his life, the king had to promise the sea troll to give him whatever first came his way when he reached shore. The king thought his hunting dog would be the first to come running to meet him, as usual, but instead, his 3 young daughters came rowing out to meet him in a boat. This filled the king with grief, and he vowed that whoever delivered his daughters should have one of them for a bride, whichever one he might choose. But the only man who seemed to want to earn the reward was a tailor named Red Peter. KNØS was given a place at the king's court, and his duty was to help the cook. But he asked to be let off on the day the troll was to come and carry away the oldest princess, and they were glad to let him go, for when he had to rinse the dishes, he broke the king's vessels of gold and silver. And when he was told to bring firewood, he brought in a whole wagon load at once, so that the doors flew from their hinges. The princess stood on the seashore and wept and wrung her hands, for she could see what she had to expect. Nor did she have much confidence in Red Peter, who sat on a willow stump with a rusty old sabre in his hand. Then KNœS came and tried to comfort the princess as well as he knew how, and asked her whether she would comb his hair. Yes, he might lay his head in her lap, and she combed his hair. Suddenly there was a dreadful roaring out at sea. It was the troll who was coming along, and he had 5 heads. Red Peter was so frightened that he rolled off his willow stump. "KNØS, is that you?" cried the troll. "Yes," said KNØS. "Haul me up on the shore," said the troll. "Pay out the cable," said KNØS. Then he hauled the troll ashore, but he had his sword of 500 weights at his side, and with it he chopped off all 5 of the troll's heads, and the princess was free. But when KNØS had gone off, Red Peter put his sabre to the breast of the princess and told her he would kill her unless she said he was her deliverer. Then came the turn of the second princess. Once more, Red Peter sat on the willow stump with his rusty sabre, and KNØS, asking to be let off for the day, went to the seashore and begged the princess to comb his hair, which she did. Then along came the troll, and this time he had 10 heads. "KNØS, is that you?" asked the troll. "Yes," said KNØS. "Haul me ashore," said the troll. "Pay out the cable," said KNØS. And this time KNØS had his sword of 10 hundredweights at his side, and he cut off all 10 of the troll's heads. And so the second princess was freed. But Red Peter held his sabre at the princess' breast and forced her to say that he had delivered her. Now it was the turn of the youngest princess. When it was time for the troll to come, Red Peter was sitting on his willow stump, and KNØS came and begged the princess to comb his hair, and she did so. This time the troll had 15 heads. "KNØS, is that you?" asked the troll. "Yes," said KNØS. "Haul me ashore," said the troll. "Pay out the cable," said KNØS. KNØS had his sword of 15 hundredweights at his side, and with it he cut off all the troll's heads. But the 15 hundredweights were half an ounce short, and the heads grew on again, and the troll took the princess and carried her off with him. One day, as KNØS was going along, he met a man carrying a church on his back. "You are a strong man, you are," said KNØS. "No, I am not strong," said he, "but KNØS at the king's court he is strong, for he can take steel and iron and weld them together with his hands as though they were clay." "Well, I'm the man of whom you are speaking," said KNØS. "Come, let us travel together." And so they wandered on. Then they met a man who carried a mountain of stone on his back. "You are strong, you are," said KNØS. "No, I'm not strong," said the man with the mountain of stone, "but KNØS at the king's court he is strong, for he can weld together steel and iron with his hands as though they were clay." "Well, I am that KNØS. Come, let us travel together," said KNØS. So all 3 of them travelled along together. KNØS took them for a sea trip, but I think they had to leave the church and the hill of stone ashore. While they were sailing, they grew thirsty, and lay alongside an island. And there on the island stood a castle, to which they decided to go and ask for a drink. Now this was the very castle in which the troll lived. First the man with the church went, and when he entered the castle, there sat the troll with the princess on his lap, and she was very sad. He asked for something to drink. "Help yourself, the goblet is on the table," said the troll. But he got nothing to drink, for though he could move the goblet from its place, he could not raise it. Then the man with the hill of stone went into the castle and asked for a drink. "Help yourself, the goblet is on the table," said the troll, and he got nothing to drink either, for though he could move the goblet from its place, he could not raise it. Then KNœS himself went into the castle, and the princess was full of joy and leaped down from the troll's lap when she saw it was he. KNØS asked for a drink. "Help yourself," said the troll, "the goblet is on the table." And KNØS took the goblet and emptied it at a single draught. Then he hit the troll across the head with the goblet, so that he rolled from the chair and died. KNØS took the princess back to the royal palace, and oh, how happy everyone was! The other princesses recognized KNØS again, for they had woven silk ribbons into his hair when they had combed it. But he could only marry one of the princesses, whichever one he preferred, so he chose the youngest. And when the king died, KNØS inherited the kingdom. As for Red Peter, he had to go into the nail barrel. And now you know all that I know. Lasse My Thrall. Once upon a time there was a prince, or a duke, or whatever you choose to call him, but at any rate a noble, tremendously high-born, who did not want to stay at home. And so he travelled about the world, and wherever he went he was well received and hobnobbed with the very finest people, for he had an unheard-of amount of money. He at once found friends and acquaintances, no matter where he came, for whoever has a full trough can always find pigs to thrust their snouts into it. But since he handled his money as he did, it grew less and less, and at last he was left high and dry, without a red cent. And there was an end to all his many friends, for they did just as the pigs do. When he had been well fleeced, they began to snivel and grunt, and soon scattered, each about his own business. And there he stood, after having been led about by the nose, abandoned by all. All had been glad to help him get rid of his money, but none were willing to help him regain it. So there was nothing left for him to do but to wander back home again like a journeyman apprentice, and beg his way as he went. Late one evening, he found himself in a big forest, without any idea as to where he might spend the night. And as he was looking around, his glance happened to fall on an old hut, peeping out from among the bushes. Of course an old hut was no lodging for such a fine gentleman, but when we cannot have what we want, we must take what we can get, and since there was no help for it, he went into the hut. There was not even a cat in it, not even a stool to sit on. But against one wall there was a great chest. What might there be in the chest? Suppose there were a few mouldy crusts of bread in it? They would taste good to him, for he had not been given a single thing all day long, and he was so hungry that his inwards stuck to his ribs. He opened the chest, but within the chest was another chest, and in that chest still another chest. And so it went, one always smaller than the other, until they were nothing but little boxes. And the more there were of them, the more trouble he took to open them, for whatever was hidden away so carefully must be something exceptionally beautiful, thought he. At last he came to a tiny box, and in the tiny box was a slip of paper, and that was all he had for his pains. At first he was much depressed, but all at once he saw that something was written on the piece of paper, and on closer examination he was even able to spell out the words, though they had a strange appearance. And he read, "Lasse My Thrall." No sooner had he spoken these words than something answered, close to his ear, "What does my master command?" He looked around, but saw no one. "That's strange," thought he, and once more read aloud, "Lasse My Thrall." And just as before came the answer, "What does my master command?" If there be someone about who hears what I say, he might be kind enough to get me a little something to eat," said he. And at that very moment a table, covered with all the good things to eat that one could imagine, was standing in the hut. He at once began to eat and drink, and did well by himself. "I have never had a better meal in my life," thought he. And when his hunger was completely satisfied, he grew sleepy and took up his scrap of paper again. "Lassie, my thrall, what does my master command? Now that you have brought me food and drink, you must also bring me a bed in which to sleep." "But it must be a very fine bed," said he, for as you may well imagine, his ideas were more top-lofty now that he had eaten well. His command was at once obeyed, and a bed so fine and handsome stood in the hut, that a king might have been glad to have found such sleeping accommodations. Now this was all very well and good, but the good can always be bettered, and when he had lain down, he decided that, after all, the hut was far too wretched for such a fine bed. He took up the scrap of paper. "Lassie, my thrall, what does my master command? If you can produce such a meal and such a bed here in the wild wood, you must surely be able to give me a better room. For you know I am one of those who are used to sleeping in a castle, with golden mirrors and rugs of gold brocade, and luxuries and conveniences of every kind," said he. And no sooner had he spoken the words than he was lying in the most magnificent room he had ever seen. Now matters were arranged to suit him, and he was quite content as he turned his face to the wall and closed his eyes. But the room he had slept in was not the end of his magnificence. When he woke the following morning and looked around, he saw that he had been sleeping in a great castle. There was one room after another, and wherever he went, walls and ceilings were covered with ornaments and decorations of every kind, all glittering so splendidly when the rays of the sun fell on them that he had to put his hand to his eyes, for wherever he looked, everything sparkled with gold and silver. Then he glanced out of the window and first began to realize how really beautiful everything was. Gone were the fir trees and juniper bushes, and in their place showed the loveliest garden one might wish to see, filled with beautiful trees and roses of every variety, in bush and tree form. But there was not a human being in sight, not even a cat, yet he found it quite natural that everything should be so fine, and that he should once more have become a great lord. He took up the scrap of paper. "Lassie, my thrall, what does my master command? Now that you have provided me with food and a castle in which to dwell, I am going to stay here, because it suits me," said he. "But I cannot live here all alone in this fashion. I must have serving men and serving maids at my command." And so it was. Servants and lackeys and maids and serving women of every description arrived, and some of them bowed and others courtesied, and now the Duke really began to feel content. Now it happened that another great castle lay on the opposite side of the forest, in which dwelt a king who owned the forest, and many broad acres of field and meadow round about. And when the king came and happened to look out of his window, he saw the new castle, on whose roof the golden weathercocks were swinging to and fro from time to time, shining in his eyes. "This is very strange," thought he, and sent for his courtiers. They came without delay, bowing and scraping. "Do you see the castle yonder?" said the king. Their eyes grew as large as saucers, and they looked. Yes, indeed, they saw the castle. "Who has dared to build such a castle on my ground?" The courtiers bowed and scraped, but did not know. So the king sent for his soldiers. They came tramping in and presented arms. "Send out all my soldiers and horsemen," said the king. "Tear down the castle instantly, hang whoever built it, and see to this at once." The soldiers assembled in the greatest haste and set forth. The drummers beat their drums, and the trumpeters blew their trumpets, and the other musicians practiced their art, each in his own way, so that the Duke heard them long before they came in sight. But this was not the first time he had heard music of this sort, and he knew what it meant, so once more he took up the scrap of paper. "Lasse My Thrall, what does my master command?" "There are soldiers coming," said he, "and now you must provide me with soldiers and horsemen until I have twice as many as the folk on the other side of the forest, and sabres and pistols and muskets and cannon and all that goes with them, but you must be quick about it." Quick it was, and when the Duke looked out, there was a countless host of soldiers drawn up around the castle. When the king's people arrived, they stopped and did not dare advance. But the Duke was by no means shy. He went at once to the king's captain and asked him what he wanted. The captain repeated his instructions. "They will not gain you anything," said the Duke. "You can see how many soldiers I have, and if the king chooses to listen to me, we can agree to become friends. I will aid him against all his enemies, and what we undertake will succeed." The captain was pleased with this proposal, so the Duke invited him to the castle. Together with all his officers and his soldiers were given a swallow or two of something wet and plenty to eat along with it. But while the Duke and the officers were eating and drinking, there was more or less talk, and the Duke learned that the king had a daughter, as yet unmarried, and so lovely that her like had never been seen. And the more they brought the king's officers to eat, the stronger they inclined to the opinion that the king's daughter would make a good wife for the Duke. And as they talked about it, the Duke himself began to think it over. "The worst of it was," said the officers, "that she was very haughty, and never even deigned to look at a man." But the Duke only laughed. "If it be no worse than that," he said, "it is a trouble that may be cured." When at last the soldiers had stowed away as much as they could hold, they shouted "Hurrah!" until they woke the echoes in the hills and marched away. One may imagine what a fine parade march it was, for some of them had grown a little loose-jointed in the knees. The Duke charged them to carry his greetings to the king and say that he would soon pay him a visit. When the Duke was alone once more, he began to think of the princess again, and whether she were really as beautiful as the soldiers had said. He decided he would like to find out for himself. Since so many strange things had happened that day, it was quite possible, thought he. "Lasse, my thrall, what does my master command?" "Only that you bring the king's daughter here, as soon as she has fallen asleep," said he. "But mind that she does not wake up, either on her way here or on her way back." And before long there lay the princess on the bed. She was sleeping soundly, and looked charming as she lay there asleep. One had to admit that she was as sweet as sugar. The Duke walked all around her, but she appeared just as beautiful from one side as from the other, and the more the Duke looked at her, the better she pleased him. "Lasse, my thrall, what does my master command?" "Now you must take the princess home again," said he, "because now I know what she looks like, and tomorrow I shall sue for her hand." The following morning the king stepped to the window. "Now I shall not have to see that castle across the way," he thought to himself, but the evil one must have had a hand in the matter. There stood the castle just as before, and the sun was shining brightly on its roof, and the weather vanes were sending beams into his eyes. The king once more fell into a rage and shouted for all his people, who hurried to him with more than usual rapidity. The courtiers bowed and scraped, and the soldiers marched in parade step and presented arms. "Do you see that castle there?" roared the king. They stretched their necks, their eyes grew large as saucers, and they looked. Yes, indeed, they saw it. "Did I not order you to tear down that castle and hang its builder?" he said. This they could not deny, but now the captain himself stepped forward and told what had occurred. and what an alarming number of soldiers the Duke had, and how magnificent his castle was. Then he also repeated what the Duke had said, and that he had sent his greetings to the king. All this made the king somewhat dizzy, and he had to set his crown on the table and scratch his head. It was beyond his comprehension, for all that he was a king, since he could have sworn that it had all come to pass in the course of a single night, and if the Duke were not the devil himself, he was at least a magician. And as he sat there and thought, the princess came in. "God greet you, father," she said. "I had a most strange and lovely dream last night." "And what did you dream, my girl?" said the king. "Oh, I dreamt that I was in the new castle over yonder, and there was a duke, handsome and so splendid beyond anything I could have imagined, and now I want a husband." "What? You want a husband? And you have never even deigned to look at a man? That is very strange," said the king. "Be that as it may," said the princess, "but that is how I feel now, and I want a husband, and the Duke is the husband I want," she concluded. The king simply could not get over the astonishment the Duke had caused him. Suddenly he heard an extraordinary beating of drums and sounding of trumpets and other instruments of every kind, and a message came that the Duke had arrived with a great retinue, all so magnificently attired that every seam of their dresses was sparkling with gold and silver. The king, in his crown and finest robe of state, stood looking down the stairway, and the princess was all the more in favor of carrying out her idea as quickly as possible. The Duke greeted the king pleasantly, and the king returned his greeting in the same way, and discussing their affairs together, they became good friends. There was a great banquet, and the Duke sat beside the princess at the table. What they said to each other I do not know, but the Duke knew so well how to talk that, no matter what he said, the princess could not say no, and so he went to the king and begged for her hand. The king could not exactly refuse it, for the Duke was the kind of a man whom it was better to have for a friend than for an enemy. But he could not give his answer out of hand, either. First he wished to see the Duke's castle and know how matters stood with regard to this, that, and the other which was natural. So it was agreed that they should pay the Duke a visit and bring the princess with them, in order that she might examine his possessions, and with that they parted. When the Duke reached home, Lasse had a lively time of it, for he was given any number of commissions, but he rushed about, carrying them out, and everything was arranged so satisfactorily that when the king arrived with his daughter, 1,000 pens could not have described it. They went through all the rooms and looked around, and everything was as it should be, and even better, thought the king, who was very happy. Then the wedding was celebrated, and when it was over, and the Duke returned home with his young wife, he, too, gave a splendid banquet, and that is how it went. After some time had passed, the Duke one evening heard the words, "Is my master content now?" It was Lasse, though the Duke could not see him. "I am well content," answered the Duke, "for you have brought me all that I have." "But what did I get for it?" said Lasse. "Nothing," replied the Duke, "but, heaven above, what was I to give you, who are not flesh and blood, and whom I cannot even see?" said he. "Yet if there be anything I can do for you, why let me know what it is, and I will do it." "I would very much like to have the little scrap of paper that you keep in the box," said Lasse. "If that is all you want, and if such a trifle is of any service to you, your wish shall be granted, for I believe I know the words by heart now," said the Duke. Lasse thanked him, and said all the Duke need do would be to lay the paper on the chair beside his bed when he went to sleep, and that he would fetch it during the night. This the Duke did, and then he went to bed and fell asleep. But toward morning the Duke woke up, freezing so that his teeth chattered, and when he had fully opened his eyes, He saw that he had been stripped of everything and had scarcely a shirt to his name. And instead of lying in the handsome bed in the handsome bedroom in the magnificent castle, he lay on the big chest in the old hut. He at once called out, "Lasse, my thrall!" But there was no answer. Then he cried again, "Lassie, my thrall!" Again there was no answer. So he called out as loudly as he could, "Lasse, my thrall!" But this third call was also in vain. Now he began to realize what had happened, and that Lasse, when he obtained the scrap of paper, no longer had to serve him, and that he himself had made this possible. But now things were as they were, and there stood the Duke in the old hut, with scarcely a shirt to his name. The princess herself was not much better off, though she had kept her clothes, for they had been given her by her father, and Lasse had no power over them. Now the Duke had to explain everything to the princess and beg her to leave him, since it would be best if he tried to get along as well as he could himself, said he. But this the princess would not do. She had a better memory for what the pastor had said when he married them, she told him, and that she was never, never to leave him. At length the king awoke in his castle, and when he looked out of the window, he saw not a single stone of the other castle in which his son-in-law and his daughter lived. He grew uneasy and sent for his courtiers. They came in, bowing and scraping. "Do you see the castle there, on the other side of the forest?" he asked. They stretched their necks and opened their eyes, but they could see nothing. "What has become of it?" said the king. But this question they were unable to answer. In a short time the king and his entire court set out, passed through the forest, and when they came to the place where the castle, with its great gardens, should have been standing, they saw nothing but juniper bushes and scrub pines. And then they happened to see the little hut amid the brush. He went in, and, oh, the poor king! What did he see? There stood his son-in-law, with scarcely a shirt to his name, and his daughter, and she had none too much to wear, and was crying and snivelling at a fearful rate. "For heaven's sake, what is the trouble here?" said the king. But he received no answer, for the Duke would rather have died than have told him the whole story. The king urged and pressed him, first amiably, then in anger, but the Duke remained obstinate and would have nothing to say. Then the king fell into a rage, which is not very surprising, for now he realized that this fine Duke was not what he purported to be, and he therefore ordered him to be hung, and hung on the spot. It is true that the princess pleaded earnestly for him, but tears and prayers were useless now, for he was a rascal and should die a rascal's death. Thus spake the king. And so it was. The king's people set up a gallows and put a rope around the Duke's neck. But as they were leading him to the gallows, the princess got hold of the hangman and gave him a gratuity, for which they were to arrange matters in such wise that the Duke need not die. And toward evening they were to cut him down, and he and the princess would disappear. So the bargain was made. In the meantime they strung him up, and then the king, together with his court, and all the people, went away. Now the Duke was at the end of his rope, yet he had time enough to reflect about his mistake in not contenting himself with an inch, instead of reaching out at once for an ell, and that he had so foolishly given back the scrap of paper to Lasse annoyed him most of all. "If I only had it again, I would show everyone that adversity has made me wise," he thought to himself. "But when the horse is stolen, we close the stable door. And that is the way of the world." And then he dangled his legs, since for the time being there was nothing else for him to do. It had been a long, hard day for him, and he was not sorry when he saw the sun sinking behind the forest. But just as the sun was setting, he suddenly heard a most tremendous "Yo-ho!" And when he looked down, there were 7 carts of worn-out shoes coming along the road, and atop. The last cart was a little old man in grey with a nightcap on his head. He had the face of some horrible spectre, and was not much better to look at in other respects. He drove straight up to the gallows, and stopped when he was directly beneath them, looked up at the Duke, and laughed, a horrible old creature. "And is this the measure of your stupidity?" he said. "But then, what is a fellow of your sort to do with his stupidity if he does not put it to some use?" And then he laughed again. "Yes, there you hang, and here I am carting off all the shoes I wore out, going about on your silly errands. I wonder sometimes whether you can actually read what is written on that scrap of paper, and whether you recognize it," said he, laughing again, indulging in all sorts of horseplay, and waving the scrap of paper under the Duke's nose. "But all who are hanging on the gallows are not dead." And this time Lasse was the greater fool of the two. The Duke snatched and tore the scrap of paper from his hand. "Lasse my Thrall, what does my master command? Cut me down from the gallows at once, and restore the castle, and everything else just as it was before. Then, when it is dark, bring the princess back to it." Everything was attended to with alarming rapidity, and soon all was exactly as it had been before Lasse had decamped. When the king awoke the following morning, he looked out of the window as usual, and there the castle was standing as before, with its weathercocks gleaming handsomely in the sunlight. He sent for his courtiers, and they came in bowing and scraping. "Do you see the castle over yonder?" asked the king. They stretched their necks and gazed and stared. Yes, indeed, they could see the castle. Then the king sent for the princess, but she was not there. Thereupon the king set off to see whether his son-in-law was hanging in the appointed spot. But no, there was not a sign of either son-in-law or gallows. Then he had to take off his crown and scratch his head. Yet that did not change matters, and he could not for the life of him understand why things should be as they were. Finally he set out with his entire court, and when they reached the spot where the castle should have been standing, there it stood. The gardens and the roses were just as they had been, and the Duke's servitors were to be seen in swarms beneath the trees. His son-in-law in person, together with his daughter, dressed in the finest clothes, came down the stairs to meet him. "The devil has a hand in it," thought the king, and so strange did all seem to him that he did not trust the evidence of his own eyes. "God greet you, and welcome, father," said the Duke. The king could only stare at him. Are you my son-in-law?" he asked. "Why, of course," said the Duke. "Who else am I supposed to be? Did I not have you strung up yesterday as a thief and a vagabond?" inquired the king. "I really believe father has gone out of his mind on the way over to us," said the Duke, and laughed. "Does father think that I would allow myself to be hanged so easily? Or is there anyone present who dare suppose such a thing?" he said, and looked them straight in the eye, so that they knew he was looking at them. They bent their backs and bowed and scraped. "And who can imagine any such thing? How could it be possible? Or should there be anyone present who dares say that the king wishes me ill? Let him speak out," said the Duke, and gazed at them with even greater keenness than before. All bent their backs and bowed and scraped. How should any of them come to any such conclusion? No, none of them were foolish to such a degree, they said. Now the king was really at a loss to know what to think. When he looked at the Duke, he felt sure that he could never have wished to harm him, and yet he was not quite sure. "Was I not here yesterday? And was not the whole castle gone? And had not an old hut taken its place? And did I not enter the hut and see you standing there with scarcely a shirt to your name?" he asked. "How father talks," said the Duke. "I am afraid, very much afraid, that trolls have blinded you and led you astray in the forest. What do you think?" he said, and turned to the courtiers. They at once bowed and cringed 50 times in succession, and took the Duke's side, as stands to reason. The king rubbed his eyes and looked around. "It must be as you say," he told the Duke, "and I believe that I have recovered my reason, and have found my eyes again. And it would have been a sin and shame had I had you hung," said he. Then he grew joyful, and no one gave the matter further thought. But adversity teaches one to be wise, so people say, and the Duke now began to attend to most things himself, and to see to it that Lasse did not have to wear out so many pairs of shoes. The king at once bestowed half the kingdom upon him, which gave him plenty to do, and people said that one would have to look far in order to find a better ruler. Then Lasse came to the Duke one day, and though he did not look much better than before, he was more civil, and did not venture to grin and carry on. "You no longer need my help," said he, "for though formerly I used to wear out all my shoes, I now cannot even wear out a single pair, and I almost believe my legs are moss-grown. Will you not discharge me?" The Duke thought he could. "I have taken great pains to spare you, and I really believe that I can get along without you," he replied. "But the castle here, and all the other things I could not well dispense with, since I never again could find an architect like yourself, and you may take for granted that I have no wish to ornament the gallows tree a second time. Therefore I will not, of my own free will, give you back the scrap of paper," said he. "While it is in your possession, I have nothing to fear," answered Lasse. "But should the paper fall into other hands, then I should have to begin to run and work all over again, and that, just that, is what I would like to prevent. When a fellow has been working 1,000 years, as I have, he is bound to grow weary at last." So they came to the conclusion that the Duke should put the scrap of paper in its little box and bury it 7 ells underground, beneath a stone that had grown there and would remain there as well. Then they thanked each other for pleasant comradeship and separated. The Duke did as he had agreed to do, and no one saw him hide the box. He lived happily with his princess and was blessed with sons and daughters. When the king died, he inherited the whole kingdom and, as you may imagine, he was none the worse off thereby. And no doubt he is still living and ruling there unless he has died. As to the little box containing the scrap of paper, many are still digging and searching for it. Finn, the Giant, and the Minster of Lund. There stands in the university town of Schonen, the town of Lund, the seat of the first archbishopric in all Scandinavia, a stately Romanic minster with a large, handsome crypt beneath the choir. The opinion is universal that the minster will never be altogether finished, but that something will always be lacking about the structure. The reason is said to be as follows. When St. Lawrence came to Lund to preach the gospel, he wanted to build a church, but did not know how he was to obtain the means to do so. While he was cudgelling his brains about it, a giant came to him and offered to build the church on condition that St. Lawrence tell him his name before the church was completed. But should St. Lawrence be unable to do so, the giant was to receive either the sun, the moon, or St. Lawrence's eyes. The saint agreed to his proposal. The building of the church made rapid progress, and ere long it was nearly finished. St. Lawrence thought ruefully about his prospects, for he did not know the giant's name, yet at the same time he did not relish losing his eyes. And it happened that while he was walking without the town, much concerned about the outcome of the affair, he grew weary and sat down on a hill to rest. As he sat there, he heard a child crying within the hill, and a woman's voice began to sing, "Sleep, sleep, my baby dear. Tomorrow your father Finn will be here. Then sun and moon you shall have from the skies to play with, or else St. Lawrence's eyes." When St. sees, Lawrence heard that he was happy, for now he knew the giant's name. He ran back quickly to town and went to the church. There sat the giant on the roof, just about to set the last stone in place, when at that very moment the saint called out, "Finn, Finn, take care how you put the stone in." Then the giant flung the stone from him, full of rage, said that the church should never be finished, and with that he disappeared. Since then, something has always been missing from the church. Others say that the giant and his wife rushed down into the crypt in their rage, and each, seizing a column, were about to tear down the church when they were turned into stone, and may be seen to this day standing beside the columns they had grasped. The Skalunda Giant. In the Skalunda mountain, near the church, there once lived a giant in the early days, who no longer felt comfortable after the church had been built there. At length he decided that he could no longer stand the ringing of the church bells, so he emigrated and settled down on an island far out in the North Sea. Once upon a time, a ship was wrecked on this island, and among those saved were several people from Skalunda. "Whence do you hail?" asked the giant, who by now had grown old and blind, and sat warming himself before a log fire. "We are from Skalunda, if you wish to know," said one of the men saved. "Give me your hand, so that I may feel whether there is still warm blood to be found in the Swedish land," said the giant. The man, who feared to shake hands with the giant, drew a red-hot bar of iron from the fire and handed it to him. He seized it firmly and pressed it so hard that the molten iron ran down between his fingers. "Yes, there is still warm blood to be found in Sweden," said he. "And tell me," he continued, "is Skalunda Mountain still standing?" "No, the hens have scratched it away," the man answered. "How could it last?" said the giant. "My wife and daughter piled it up in the course of a single Sunday morning. But surely the Hallenberg and the Hunneberg are still standing, for those I built myself." When the man had confirmed this, the giant wanted to know whether Karin was still living in Stommen. And when they told him that she was, he gave them a girdle, and with it the message that Karin was to wear it in remembrance of him. The men took the girdle and gave it to Karin upon their return home. But before Karin put it on, she clasped it around the oak tree that grew in the court. No sooner had she done so than the oak tore itself out of the ground and flew to the north, borne away by the storm wind. In the place where it had stood was a deep pit, and the roots of the tree were so enormous that one of the best springs in Stommen flows from one of the root holes to this very day. Yuletide Specters. Once upon a time there lived two peasants on a homestead called Vaderas, just as there are two peasants living on it now. In those days the roads were good, and the women were in the habit of riding when they wanted to go to church. One Christmas, the two women agreed that they would ride to Christmas night mass, and whichever one of them woke up at the right time was to call the other. For in those days there was no such thing as a watch. It was about midnight when one of the women thought she heard a voice from the window, calling, "I am going to set out now." She got up hurriedly and dressed herself so that she might be able to ride with the other woman. But since there was no time to eat, she took a piece of bread from the table along with her. In those times, it was customary to bake the bread in the shape of a cross. It was a piece of this kind that the woman took and put in her pocket, in order to eat it under way. She rode as fast as she could to catch up with her friend, but could not overtake her. The way led over a little stream which flows into Videstern Lake, and across the stream was a bridge, known as the Earth Bridge, and on the bridge stood 2 witch trolls, busy washing. As the woman came riding across the bridge, one of the witch trolls called out to the other, "Hurry, and tear her head from her shoulders." "That I cannot do," returned the other, "because she has a bit of bread in the form of a cross in her pocket." The woman, who had been unable to catch up with her neighbour, reached the church at Hanger alone. The church was full of lights, as was always the case when the Christmas Mass was said. As quickly as ever she could, the woman tied up her horse and hurriedly entered the church. It seemed to her that the church was crowded with people, but all of them were headless, and at the altar stood the priest in full canonicals, but without a head. In her haste, she did not at once see how things were, but sat down in her accustomed place. As she sat down, it seemed to her that someone said, "If I had not stood godfather to you when you were christened, I would do away with you as you sit there, and now hurry and make yourself scarce, or it will be the worse for you." Then she realized that things were not as they should be, and ran out hastily. When she came into the churchyard, it seemed to her as though she was surrounded by a great crowd of people. In those days, people wore broad mantles of unbleached wool, woven at home and white in colour. She was wearing one of these mantles, and the spectres seized it, but she flung it away from her and managed to escape from the churchyard and run to the poorhouse and wake the people there. It is said it was then 1 o'clock at night. So she sat and waited for the early Mass at 4 o'clock in the morning. And when day finally dawned, they found a little piece of her mantle on every grave in the churchyard. A similar experience befell a man and his wife who lived in a hut known as Inger's, below Mosled. They were no more than an hour ahead of time, but when they reached the church at Hanger, they thought the service had already begun, and wanted to enter at once, but the church was barred and bolted, and the phantom service of the dead was nearing its end. And when the actual Mass began, there was found lying at every place some of the earth from the graves of those who shortly before had been worshipping. The man and his wife thereupon fell grievously ill, because they had disturbed the dead. Silverwhite and Lillwacker. Once upon a time there was a king who had a queen whom he loved with a great love. But after a time the queen died, and all he had left was an only daughter. And now that the king was a widower, his whole heart went out to the little princess, whom he cherished as the apple of his eye. And the king's young daughter grew up into the most lovely maiden ever known. When the princess had seen the snows of 15 winters, it happened that a great war broke out, and that her father had to march against the foe. But there was no one to whom the king could entrust his daughter while he was away at war, so he had a great tower built out in the forest, provided it with a plenteous store of supplies, and in it shut up his daughter and a maid. And he had it proclaimed that every man, no matter who he might be, was forbidden to approach the tower in which he had placed his daughter and the maid, under pain of death. Now the king thought he had taken every precaution to protect his daughter, and went off to war. In the meantime the princess and her maid sat in the tower, but in the city there were a number of brave young sons of kings, as well as other young men, who would have liked to have talked to the beautiful maiden. And when they found that this was forbidden them, they conceived a great hatred for the king. At length they took counsel with an old woman who was wiser than most folk, and told her to arrange matters in such wise that the king's daughter and her maid might come into disrepute without their having anything to do with it. The old hag promised to help them, enchanted some apples, laid them in a basket, and went to the lonely tower in which the maidens lived. When the king's daughter and her maid saw the old woman, who was sitting beneath the window, they felt a great longing to try the beautiful apples. So they called out and asked how much she wanted for her precious apples, but the old woman said they were not for sale. Yet as the girls kept on pleading with her, the old woman said she would make each of them a present of an apple. They only need let down a little basket from the tower. The princess and her maid, in all innocence, did as the troll woman told them, and each received an apple. But the enchanted fruit had a strange effect, for in due course of time heaven sent them each a child. The king's daughter called her son Silverwhite, and the son of her maid received the name of Lillwacker. The two boys grew up larger and stronger than other children, and were very handsome as well. They looked as much alike as one cherry pit does to another, and one could easily see that they were related. 7 years had passed, and the king was expected home from the war. Then both girls were terrified, and they took counsel together as to how they might hide their children. When at length they could find no other way out of the difficulty, they very sorrowfully bade their children farewell and let them down from the tower at night, to seek their fortune in the wide, wide world. At parting, the king's daughter gave Silverwhite a costly knife, but the maid had nothing to give her son. The two foster brethren now wandered out into the world. After they had gone a while, they came to a dark forest, and in this forest they met a man, strange-looking and very tall. He wore 2 swords at his side, and was accompanied by 6 great dogs. He gave them a friendly greeting. "Good day, little fellows. Whence do you come, and whither do you go?" The boys told him they came from a high tower, and were going out into the world to seek their fortune. The man replied, "If such be the case, I know more about your origin than anyone else, and that you may have something by which to remember your father, I will give each of you a sword and 3 dogs. But you must promise me one thing, that you will never part from your dogs, but take them with you wherever you go." The boys thanked the man for his kind gifts, and promised to do as he had told them. Then they bade him farewell and went their way. When they had travelled for some time, they reached a crossroad. Then Silverwhite said, "It seems to me that it would be the best for us to try our luck singly, so let us part." Lillwacker answered, "Your advice is good, but how am I to know whether or not you are doing well out in the world?" "I will give you a token by which you may tell," said Silverwhite. "So long as the water runs clear in this spring, you will know that I am alive. But if it turns red and roiled, it will mean that I am dead." Silverwhite then drew runes in the water of the spring, said farewell to his brother, and each of them went on alone. Lillwacker soon came to a king's court, and took service there. But every morning he would go to the spring to see how his brother fared. Silverwhite continued to wander over hill and dale, until he reached a great city. But the whole city was in mourning, the houses were hung in black, and all the inhabitants went about full of grief and care, as though some great misfortune had occurred. Silverwhite went through the city, and inquired as to the cause of all the unhappiness he saw. They answered, "You must have come from far away, since you do not know that the king and queen were in danger of being drowned at sea, and he had to promise to give up their 3 daughters in order to escape. Tomorrow morning the sea troll is coming to carry off the oldest princess." This news pleased Silverwhite, for he saw a fine opportunity to wealth and fame, should fortune favour him. The next morning Silverwhite hung his sword at his side, called his dogs to him, and wandered down to the seashore alone. And as he sat on the strand, he saw the king's daughter led out of the city, and with her went a courtier, who had promised to rescue her. But the princess was very sad, and cried bitterly. Then Silverwhite stepped up to her with a polite greeting. When the king's daughter and her escort saw the fearless youth, they were much frightened, because they thought he was the sea troll. The courtier was so alarmed that he ran away and took refuge in a tree. When Silverwhite saw how frightened the princess was, he said, "Lovely maiden, do not fear me, for I will do you no harm." The king's daughter answered, "Are you the troll who is coming to carry me away?" "No," said Silverwhite, "I have come to rescue you." Then the princess was glad to think that such a brave hero was going to defend her, and they had a long, friendly talk. At the same time, Silverwhite begged the king's daughter to comb his hair. She complied with his request, and Silverwhite laid his head in her lap. But when he did so, the princess drew a golden ring from her finger and, unbeknown to him, wound it into his locks. Suddenly, the sea troll rose from the deeps, setting the waves whirling and foaming far and near. When the troll saw Silverwhite, he grew angry and said, "Why do you sit there beside my princess?" The youth replied, "It seems to me that she is my princess, not yours." The sea troll answered, "Time enough to see which of us is right, but first our dogs shall fight." Silverwhite was nothing loath, and set his dogs at the dogs of the troll, and there was a fierce struggle. But at last the youth's dogs got the upper hand and bit the dogs of the sea troll to death. Then Silverwhite drew his sword with a great sweep, rushed upon the sea troll, and gave him such a tremendous blow that the monster's head rolled on the sand. The troll gave a fearsome cry and flung himself back into the sea, so that the water spurted to the very skies. Thereupon the youth drew out his silver-mounted knife, cut out the troll's eyes, and put them in his pocket. Then he saluted the lovely princess and went away. Now when the battle was over and the youth had disappeared, the courtier crawled down from his tree and threatened to kill the princess if she did not say before all the people that he, and none other, had rescued her. The king's daughter did not dare refuse, since she feared for her life. So she returned to her father's castle with the courtier, where they were received with great distinction, and joy reigned throughout the land when the news spread that the oldest princess had been rescued from the troll. On the following day, everything repeated itself. Silverwhite went down to the strand and met the second princess, just as she was to be delivered to the troll. And when the king's daughter and her escort saw him, they were very much frightened, thinking he was the sea troll. And the courtier climbed a tree, just as he had before, but the princess granted the youth's petition, combed his hair as her sister had done, and also wound her gold ring into his long curls. After a time, there was a great tumult out at sea, and a sea troll rose from the waves. He had 3 heads and 3 dogs, but Silverwhite's dogs overcame those of the troll, and the youth killed the troll himself with his sword. Thereupon he took out his silver-mounted knife, cut out the troll's eyes, and went his way. But the courtier lost no time. He climbed down from his tree and forced the princess to promise to say that he, and none other, had rescued her. Then they returned to the castle, where the courtier was acclaimed as the greatest of heroes. On the 3rd day, Silverwhite hung his sword at his side, called his 3 dogs to him, and again wandered down to the seashore. As he was sitting by the strand, he saw the youngest princess led out of the city, and with her the daring courtier who claimed to have rescued her sisters. But the princess was very sad and cried bitterly. Then Silverwhite stepped up and greeted the lovely maiden politely. Now when the king's daughter and her escort saw the handsome youth, they were very much frightened, for they believed him to be the sea troll, and the courtier ran away and hid in a high tree that grew near the strand. When Silverwhite noticed the maiden's terror, he said, "Lovely maiden, do not fear me, for I will do you no harm." The king's daughter answered, "Are you the troll who is coming to carry me away?" "No," said Silverwhite, "I have come to rescue you." Then the princess was very glad to have such a brave hero fight for her, and they had a long friendly talk with each other. At the same time, Silverwhite begged the lovely maiden to do him a favour and comb his hair. This the king's daughter was most willing to do, and Silverwhite laid his head in her lap. But when the princess saw the gold rings her sisters had wound in his locks, she was much surprised, and added her own to the others. Suddenly the sea troll came shooting up out of the deep with a terrific noise, so that waves and foam spurted to the very skies. This time the monster had 6 heads and 9 dogs. When the troll saw Silverwhite sitting with the king's daughter, he fell into a rage and cried, "What are you doing with my princess?" The youth answered, "It seems to me that she is my princess rather than yours." Thereupon the troll said, "Time enough to see which of us is right, but first our dogs shall fight each other." Silverwhite did not delay, but set his dogs at the sea dogs, and they had a battle royal. But in the end the youth's dogs got the upper hand and bit all 9 of the sea dogs to death. Finally Silverwhite drew out his bare sword, flung himself upon the sea troll, and stretched all 6 of his heads on the sand with a single blow. The monster uttered a terrible cry and rushed back into the sea, so that the water spurted to the heavens. Then the youth drew his silver-mounted knife, cut out all 12 of the troll's eyes, saluted the king's young daughter, and hastily went away. Now that the battle was over, and the youth had disappeared, the courtier climbed down from his tree, drew his sword, and threatened to kill the princess unless she promised to say that he had rescued her from the troll, as he had her sisters. The king's daughter did not dare refuse, since she feared for her life. So they went back to the castle together, and when the king saw that they had returned in safety, without so much as a scratch, he and the whole court were full of joy, and they were accorded great honours. And at court, the courtier was quite another fellow from the one who had hid away in the tree. The king had a splendid banquet prepared, with amusements and games, and the sound of string music and dancing, and bestowed the hand of his youngest daughter on the courtier in reward for his bravery. In the midst of the wedding festivities, when the king and his whole court were seated at table, the door opened, and in came Silverwhite with his dogs. The youth stepped boldly into the hall of state and greeted the king. And when the 3 princesses saw who it was, they were full of joy, leaped up from their places, and ran over to him, much to the king's surprise, who asked what it all meant. Then the youngest princess told him all that had happened, from beginning to end, and that Silverwhite had rescued them, while the courtier sat in a tree. To prove it beyond any chance of doubt, each of the king's daughters showed her father the ring she had wound in Silverwhite's locks. But the king still did not know quite what to think of it all, until Silverwhite said, "My lord king, in order that you need not doubt what your daughters have told you, I will show you the eyes of the sea trolls whom I slew." Then the king and all the rest saw that the princesses had told the truth. The traitorous courtier received his just punishment, but Silverwhite was paid every honour, and was given the youngest daughter and half of the kingdom with her. After the wedding, Silverwhite established himself with his young bride in a large castle belonging to the king, and there they lived quietly and happily. One night, when all were sleeping, it chanced that he heard a knocking at the window and a voice which said, "Come, Silverwhite, I have to talk to you." The king, who did not want to wake his young wife, rose hastily, girded on his sword, called his dogs, and went out. When he reached the open air, there stood a huge and savage-looking troll. The troll said, "Silverwhite, you have slain my 3 brothers, and I have come to bid you go down to the seashore with me, that we may fight with one another." This proposal suited the youth, and he followed the troll without protest. When they reached the seashore, there lay 3 great dogs belonging to the troll. Silverwhite at once set his dogs as the troll dogs, and after a hard struggle, the latter had to give in. The young king drew his sword, bravely attacked the troll, and dealt him many a mighty blow. It was a tremendous battle. But when the troll noticed he was getting the worst of it, he grew frightened, quickly ran to a high tree, and clambered into it. Silverwhite and the dogs ran after him, the dogs barking as loudly as they could. Then the troll begged for his life and said, "Dear Silverwhite, I will take a wergild for my brothers. Only bid your dogs be still, so that we may talk." The king bade his dogs be still, but in vain. They only barked the more loudly. Then the troll tore 3 hairs from his head, handed them to Silverwhite, and said, "Lay a hair on each of the dogs, and then they will be as quiet as can be." The king did so, and at once the dogs fell silent and lay motionless, as though they had grown fast to the ground. Now Silverwhite realized that he had been deceived, but it was too late. The troll was already descending from the tree, and he drew his sword and again began to fight. But they had exchanged no more than a few blows before Silverwhite received a mortal wound and lay on the earth in a pool of blood. But now we must tell about Lillwacker. The next morning he went to the spring by the crossroad and found it red with blood. Then he knew that Silverwhite was dead. He called his dogs, hung his sword at his side, and went on until he came to a great city. And the city was in festal array. The streets were crowded with people, and the houses were hung with scarlet cloths and splendid rugs. Lillwacker asked why everybody was so happy, and they said, "You must hail from distant parts. Since you do not know that a famous hero has come here by the name of Silverwhite, who has rescued our 3 princesses and is now the king's son-in-law." Lillwacker then inquired how it had all come about, and then went his way, reaching the royal castle in which Silverwhite dwelt with his beautiful queen in the evening. When Lillwacker entered the castle gate, all greeted him as though he had been the king, for he resembled his foster brother so closely that none could tell one from the other. When the youth came to the queen's room, she also took him for Silverwhite. She went up to him and said, "My lord king, where have you been so long? I have been awaiting you with great anxiety." Lillwacker said little and was very taciturn. Then he lay down on a couch in a corner of the queen's room. The young woman did not know what to think of his actions, for her husband did not act queerly at other times, but she thought, "One should not try to discover the secrets of others," and said nothing. In the night, when all were sleeping, there was a knocking at the window, and a voice cried, "Come, Lillwacker, I have to talk to you." The youth rose hastily, took his good sword, called his dogs, and went. When he reached the open air, there stood the same troll who had slain Silverwhite. He said, "Come with me, Lillwacker, and then you shall see your foster brother." To this Lillwacker at once agreed, and the troll led the way. When they came to the seashore, there lay the 3 great dogs whom the troll had brought with him. Somewhat further away, where they had fought, lay Silverwhite in a pool of blood, and beside him his dogs were stretched out on the ground as though they had taken root in it. Then Lillwacker saw how everything had happened, and thought that he would gladly venture his life if he might in some way call his brother back from the dead. He at once set his dogs at the troll dogs, and they had a hard struggle, in which Lillwacker's dogs won the victory. Then the youth drew his sword and attacked the troll with mighty blows. But when the troll saw that he was getting the worst of it, he took refuge in a lofty tree. Lillwacker and his dogs ran after him, and the dogs barked loudly. Then the troll humbly begged for his life and said, "Dear Lillwacker, I will give you wergild for your brother. Only bid your dogs be still so that we may talk." At the same time, the troll handed him 3 hairs from his head and added, "Lay one of these hairs on each of your dogs, and then they will soon be quiet." But Lillwacker saw through his cunning scheme, took the 3 hares and laid them on the troll dogs, which at once fell on the ground and lay like dead. When the troll saw that his attempt had failed, he was much alarmed and said, "Dearest Lillwacker, I will give you Wergild for your brother, if you will only leave me alone." But the youth answered, "What is there you can give me that will compensate for my brother's life?" The troll replied, "Here are 2 flasks. In one is a liquid which, if you anoint a dead man with it, it will restore him to life. But as to the liquid in the other flask, if you moisten anything with it, and someone touches the place you have moistened, he will be unable to move from the spot. I think it would be hard to find anything more precious than the liquid in these flasks." Lillwacker said, "Your proposal suits me, and I will accept it. But there is something else you must promise to do, that you will release my brother's dogs." The troll agreed, climbed down from the tree, breathed on the dogs, and thus freed them. Then Lillwacker took the 2 flasks and went away from the seashore with the troll. After they had gone a while, they came to a great flat stone lying near the highway. Lillwacker hastened on in advance and moistened it with liquid from the 2nd flask. Then, as he was going by, Lillwacker suddenly set all 6 of his dogs at the troll, who stepped back and touched the stone. There he stuck, and could move neither forward nor backward. After a time, the sun rose and shone on the stone, and when the troll saw the sun, he burst and was as dead as a doornail. Lillwacker now ran back to his brother and sprinkled him with the liquid in the other flask, so that he came to life again, and they were both very happy, as may well be imagined. The 2 foster brothers then returned to the castle, recounting the story of their experiences and adventures on the way. Lillwacker told how he had been taken for his brother. He even mentioned that he had lain down on a couch in a corner of the Queen's room, and that she had never suspected that he was not her rightful husband. But when Silverwhite heard that, he thought that Lillwacker had offended against the Queen's dignity, and he grew angry and fell into such a rage that he drew his sword and thrust it into his brother's breast. Lillwacker fell to earth dead, and Silverwhite went home to the castle alone. But Lillwacker's dogs would not leave their master, and lay around him, whining and licking his wound. In the evening, when the young king and his wife retired, the Queen asked him why he had been so taciturn and serious the evening before. Then the Queen said, "I am very curious to know what has befallen you during the last few days, but what I would like to know most of all is why you lay down on a couch in a corner of my room the other night." Now it was clear to Silverwhite that the brother he had slain was innocent of all offence, and he felt bitter regret at having repaid his faithfulness so badly. So King Silverwhite at once rose and went to the place where his brother was lying. He poured the water of life from his flask and anointed his brother's wound, and in a moment Lillwacker was alive again, and the 2 brothers went joyfully back to the castle. When they got there, Silverwhite told his queen how Lillwacker had rescued him from death, and all the rest of their adventures, and all were happy at the royal court, and they paid the youth the greatest honours and compliments. After he had stayed there a time, he sued for the hand of the 2nd princess and obtained it. Thereupon the wedding was celebrated with great pomp, and Silverwhite divided his half of the kingdom with his foster brother. The 2 brothers continued to live together in peace and unity, and if they have not died, they are living still. Stompe Pilt, not far from Balsberg, near Filkstad in the Willand Sherrad, there is a hill in which a giant named Stompe Pilt once used to live. It happened one day that a goat-herd was driving his flock up the hill in which Stompe Pilt dwelt. "Who is there?" cried the giant, and rushed out of his hill with a hunk of flint rock in his fist. I am, if that's what you want to know," shouted the shepherd lad, and continued driving his goats up the hill. "If you come here, I will squash you as I squash this stone," cried the giant, and he crushed it into fine sand between his fingers. "And I will squash you till the water runs out, just as I squash this stone," answered the shepherd lad, drawing a fresh cheese from his pocket and pressing it hard, so that the water ran from his fingers. "Are you not frightened?" asked the giant. "Of you? Certainly not," was the youth's reply. "Then we will fight with one another," proposed the giant. "As you choose," replied the shepherd, "but first we must abuse each other, so that we can get into a proper rage, because as we abuse each other, we will grow angry, and when we are angry we will fight." "But I shall begin by abusing you," said the giant. "As you choose," said the youth, "but then it will be my turn." "May a troll with a crooked nose take you," yelled the giant. "May a flying devil carry you off," answered the shepherd, and he shot a sharp arrow against the giant's body with his bow. "What was that?" asked the giant, and tried to pull the arrow out of his body. "That was a word of abuse," said the shepherd. "How does it come to have feathers?" asked the giant. "The better to fly with," answered the shepherd. "Why does it stick so tight?" the giant continued. "Because it has taken root in your body," was the shepherd's answer. "Have you any other abusive words of the same sort?" asked the giant. "Here is another one," replied the youth, and shot another arrow into the giant. "Ouch, ouch!" cried Stompe Pilt. "Are you still not angry enough for us to come to blows?" "No, I have not abused you enough as yet," said the shepherd, and aimed another arrow. "Lead your goats wherever you choose. If I cannot stand your abusive words, I surely will not be able to bear up against your blows," cried Stompe Pilt, and jumped back into his hill. And that is how the shepherd gained the victory, because he was brave and did not let the stupid giant frighten him. The Girl and the Snake. Once upon a time there was a girl who was to go to the wood and drive the cattle home, but she did not find the herd, and losing her way instead, came to a great hill. It had gates and doors, and she went in. There stood a table covered with all sorts of good things to eat, and there stood a bed as well, and in the bed lay a great snake. The snake said to the girl, "Sit down if you choose, eat if you choose, come and lie down in the bed if you choose. But if you do not choose, then do not do so." So the girl did nothing at all. At last the snake said, "Some people are coming now who want you to dance with them, but do not go along with them." Straightway people arrived who wanted to dance with the girl, but she would hear nothing of it. Then they began to eat and drink, but the girl left the hill and went home. The following day she again went to the wood to look for the cattle, did not find them, lost her way again, and came to the same hill. This time she also entered, and found everything as it had been the first time, the well-spread table and the bed with the snake in it. And the snake said to her, as before, "Sit down if you choose, eat if you choose, come, and lie down in the bed if you choose. But if you do not choose, then do not do so. Now a great many more people are coming who will want to dance with you, but do not go with them." The snake had scarcely concluded before a great many people arrived, who began to dance, eat and drink, but the girl did not keep them company. Instead, she left the hill and went home. On the third day, when she once more went to the wood, everything happened exactly as on the first and second day. The snake invited her to eat and drink, and this time she did so, with a hearty appetite. Then the snake told her to lie down beside him, and the girl obeyed. Then the snake said, "Put your arm about me." She did so. "And now kiss me," said the snake. "But if you are afraid, put your apron between us." The girl did so, and in a moment the snake was turned into a marvelously handsome youth, who was really a prince, bewitched in the form of a snake by magic spells, and now delivered by the girl's courage. Then both of them went away, and there was nothing further heard of them. Faithful and Unfaithful. Once upon a time there was a couple of humble cottagers who had no children until, at last, the man's wife was blessed with a boy, which made both of them very happy. They named him Faithful, and when he was christened, a huldra came to the hut, seated herself beside the child's cradle, and foretold that he would meet with good fortune. "What is more," she said, "when he is 15 years of age, I will make him a present of a horse with many rare qualities, a horse that has the gift of speech." And with that, the huldra turned and went away. The boy grew up and became strong and powerful. And when he had passed his 15th year, a strange old man came up to their hut one day, knocked, and said that the horse he was leading had been sent by his queen, and that henceforward it was to belong to Faithful as she had promised. Then the ancient man departed, but the beautiful horse was admired by all, and Faithful learned to love it more with every passing day. At length he grew weary of home. "I must away and try my fortune in the world," said he, and his parents did not like to object, for there was not much to wish for at home. So he let his dear horse from the stable, swung himself into the saddle, and rode hurriedly into the wood. He rode on, and had already covered a good bit of ground, when he saw 2 lions engaged in a struggle with a tiger, and they were well nigh overcome. "Make haste to take your bow," said the horse. "Shoot the tiger and deliver the 2 lions." "Yes, that's what I will do," said the youth, fitted an arrow to the bowstring, and in a moment the tiger lay prone on the ground. The 2 lions drew nearer, nuzzled their preserver in a friendly and grateful manner, and then hastened back to their cave. Faithful now rode along for a long time among the great trees, until he suddenly spied 2 terrified white doves fleeing from a hawk who was on the point of catching them. "Make haste to take your bow," said the horse. "Shoot the hawk and save the 2 doves." "Yes, that's what I'll do," said the youth. He fitted an arrow to the bowstring, and in a moment the hawk lay prone on the ground. But the 2 doves flew nearer, fluttered about their deliverer in a tame and grateful manner, and then hurried back to their nest. The youth pressed on through the wood, and by now was far, far from home. But his horse did not tire easily, and ran on with him until they came to a great lake. There he saw a gull rise up from the water, holding a pike in its claws. "Make haste to take your bow," said the horse. "Shoot the gull and save the pike." "Yes, that's what I'll do," answered the youth, fitted an arrow to his bowstring, and in a moment the gull was threshing the ground with its wings, mortally wounded. But the pike who had been saved swam nearer, gave his deliverer a friendly, grateful glance, and then dove down to join his fellows beneath the waves. Faithful rode on again, and before evening came to a great castle. He at once had himself announced to the king, and begged that the latter would take him into his service. "What kind of a place do you want?" asked the king, who was inclined to look with favour on the bold horseman. "I should like to be a groom," was Faithful's answer, "but first of all I must have stable room and fodder for my horse." "That you shall have," said the king, and the youth was taken on as a groom, and served so long and so well that everyone in the castle liked him, and the king in particular praised him highly. But among the other servitors was one named Unfaithful, who was jealous of Faithful, and did what he could to harm him, for he thought to himself Then I would be rid of him, and need not see him continue to rise in my lord's favour. Now it happened that the king was very sad, for he had lost his queen, whom a troll had stolen from the castle. It is true that the queen had not taken pleasure in the king's society, and that she did not love him. Still, the king longed for her greatly, and often spoke of it to Unfaithful, his servant. So one day Unfaithful said, "My lord need distress himself no longer, for Faithful has been boasting to me that he could rescue your beautiful queen from the hands of the troll." "If he has done so," replied the king, "then he must keep his word." He straightway ordered Faithful to be brought before him, and threatened him with death if he did not at once hurry into the hill and bring back the wife of whom he had been robbed. If he was successful, great honour should be his reward. In vain, Faithful denied what Unfaithful had said of him. The king stuck to his demand, and the youth withdrew, convinced that he had not long to live. Then he went to the stable to bid farewell to his beautiful horse, and stood beside him and wept. "What grieves you so?" asked the horse. Then the youth told him of all that had happened, and said that this was probably the last time he would be able to visit him. "If it be no more than that," said the horse, "there is a way to help you. Up in the garret of the castle there is an old fiddle. Take it with you, and play it when you come to the place where the queen is kept. And fashion for yourself armour of steel wire, and set knives into it everywhere. And then, when you see the troll open his jaws, descend into his maw, and thus slay him. But you must have no fear, and must trust me to show you the way." These words filled the youth with fresh courage. He went to the king and received permission to leave, secretly fashioned his steel armour, took the old fiddle from the garret of the castle, led his dear horse out of the stable, and without delay set forth for the Troll's Hill. Before long he saw it, and rode directly to the Troll's abode. When he came near, he saw the Troll, who had crept out of his castle, lying stretched out at the entrance to his cave, fast asleep, and snoring so powerfully that the whole hill shook. But his mouth was wide open, and his maw was so tremendous that it was easy for the youth to crawl into it. He did so, for he was not afraid, and made his way into the Troll's inwards, where he was so active that the Troll was soon killed. Then Faithful crept out again, laid aside his armour, and entered the Troll's castle. Within the great golden hall sat the captive queen, fettered with 7 strong chains of gold. Faithful could not break the strong chains, but he took up his fiddle and played such tender music on it that the golden chains were moved, and one after another fell from the queen, until she was able to rise and was free once more. She looked at the courageous youth with joy and gratitude, and felt very kindly toward him, because he was so handsome and courteous, and the queen was perfectly willing to return with him to the king's castle. The return of the queen gave rise to great joy, and Faithful received the promised reward from the king. But now the queen treated her husband with even less consideration than before. She would not exchange a word with him. She did not laugh, and locked herself up in her room with her gloomy thoughts. This greatly vexed the king, and one day he asked the queen why she was so sad. "Well," said she, "I cannot be happy unless I have the beautiful golden hall which I had in the hill at the Troll's. For a hall like that is to be found nowhere else. It will be no easy matter to obtain it for you," said the king, "and I cannot promise you that anyone will be able to do it." But when he complained of his difficulty to his servant, Unfaithful, the latter answered, "The chances of success are not so bad, for Faithful said he could easily bring the Troll's golden hall to the castle." Faithful was at once sent for, and the king commanded him, as he loved his life, to make good his word and bring the golden hall from the Troll's Hill. It was in vain that Faithful denied Unfaithful's assertions. Go he must, and bring back the golden hall. Inconsolable, he went to his beautiful horse, wept, and wanted to say farewell to him forever. "What troubles you?" asked the horse. And the youth replied, "Unfaithful has again been telling lies about me, and if I do not bring the Troll's golden hall to the Queen, my life will be forfeited." "Is it nothing more serious than that?" said the horse. "See that you obtain a great ship. Take your fiddle with you and play the golden hall out of the hill. Then hitch the Troll's horses before it, and you will be able to bring the glistening hall here without trouble." Then Faithful felt somewhat better, did as the horse had told him, and was successful in reaching the great hill. And as he stood there playing the fiddle, the golden hall heard him, and was drawn to the sounding music, and it moved slowly, slowly, until it stood outside the hill. It was built of virgin gold, like a house by itself, and under it were many wheels. Then the youth took the Troll's horses, put them to the golden hall, and thus brought it aboard his ship. Soon he had crossed the lake and brought it along safely, so that it reached the castle without damage, to the great joy of the Queen. Yet, despite the fact, she was as weary of everything as she had been before, never spoke to her husband, the king, and no one ever saw her laugh. Now the king grew even more vexed than he had been, and again asked her why she seemed so sad. "Ah, how can I be happy unless I have the 2 colts that used to belong to me when I stayed at the Troll's? Such handsome steeds are to be seen nowhere else." "It will be anything but easy to obtain for you what you want," declared the king, "for they were untamed, and long ago must have run far away into the wild wood." Then he left her sadly, and did not know what to do. But Unfaithful said, "Let my lord give himself no concern, for Faithful has declared he could easily secure both of the Troll's colts." Faithful was at once sent for, and the king threatened him with death if he did not show his powers in the matter of the colts. But should he succeed in catching them, then he would be rewarded. Now Faithful knew quite well that he could not hope to catch the Troll's wild colts, and he once more turned to the stable in order to bid farewell to the Huldre's gift. "Why do you weep over such a trifle?" said the horse. "Hurry to the wood, play your fiddle, and all will be well." Faithful did as he was told, and after a while the 2 lions whom he had rescued came leaping toward him, listened to his playing, and asked him whether he was in distress. "Yes, indeed," said Faithful, and told them what he had to do. They at once ran back into the wood, one to one side and the other to the other, and returned quickly, driving the 2 colts before them. Then Faithful played his fiddle, and the colts followed him, so that he soon reached the king's castle in safety, and could deliver the steeds to the Queen. The king now expected that his wife would be gay and happy, but she did not change, never addressed a word to him, and only seemed a little less sad when she happened to speak to the daring youth. Then the king asked her to tell him what she lacked, and why she was so discontented. She answered, "I have secured the colts of the Troll, and I often sit in the glittering hall of gold, but I can open none of the handsome chests that are filled to the brim with my valuables, because I have no keys, and if I do not get the keys again, how can I be happy?" "And where may the keys be?" asked the king. "In the lake by the Troll's Hill," said the Queen, "for that is where I threw them when Faithful brought me here." "This is a ticklish affair, this business of those keys you want," said the king, "and I can scarcely promise that you will ever see them again." In spite of this, however, He was willing to make an attempt and talked it over with his servant, Unfaithful. "Why, that is easily done," said the latter, "for Faithful boasted to me that he could get the Queen's keys without any difficulty if he wished." "Then I shall compel him to keep his word," said the king, and he at once ordered Faithful, on pain of death, to get the Queen's keys out of the lake by the Troll's Hill without delay. This time the youth was not so depressed, for he thought to himself, "My wise horse will be able to help me." And so he was, for he advised him to go along playing his fiddle, and to wait for what might happen. After the youth had played for a while, the pike he had saved thrust his head out of the water, recognized him, and asked whether he could be of any service to him. "Yes, indeed," said the youth, and told him what it was he wanted. The pike at once dived, quickly rose to the surface of the water with the golden keys in his mouth, and gave them to his deliverer. The latter hastened back with them, and now the Queen could open the great chests in the golden hall to her heart's content. Notwithstanding, the king's wife was as sorrowful as ever, and when the king complained about it to Unfaithful, the latter said, "No doubt it is because she loves Faithful. I would therefore advise that my lord have him beheaded. Then there will be a change." This advice suited the king well, and he determined to carry it out shortly. But one day Faithful's horse said to him, "The king is going to have your head chopped off, so hurry to the wood, play your fiddle, and beg the two doves to bring you a bottle of the water of life. Then go to the Queen and ask her to set your head on your body and to sprinkle you with the water when you have been beheaded." Faithful did so. He went to the wood that very day with his fiddle, and before long the two doves were fluttering around him, and shortly after brought back the bottle filled with the water of life. He took it back home with him and gave it to the Queen, so that she might sprinkle him with it after he had been beheaded. She did so, and at once Faithful rose again, as full of life as ever, but far better looking. The king was astonished at what he had seen, and told the Queen to cut off his own head and then sprinkle him with the water. She at once seized the sword, and in a moment the king's head rolled to the ground. But she sprinkled none of the water of life upon it, and the king's body was quickly carried out and buried. Then the Queen and Faithful celebrated their wedding with great pomp, but Unfaithful was banished from the land and went away in disgrace. The wise horse dwelt contentedly in a wonderful chamber, and the king and queen kept the magic fiddle, the golden hall, and the troll's other valuables, and lived in peace and happiness day after day. Starkad. The hero of the legends, the bravest warrior in the army of the north, had fallen into disgrace with the king because of a certain princess. So he wandered up into Norland and settled down at Rude in Tuna, where he was known as the Thrall of the Alders, or the Red Fellow. In Balbo, 9 miles from Rude, dwelt another hero, Bale, a good friend and companion at arms of Starkad. One morning Starkad climbed the Clefberg in Tuna and called over to Bale. "Bale in Balbo, are you awake?" "Red Fellow," answered Bale 9 miles away, "the sun and I wake together. But how goes it with you?" "None too well. I eat salmon morning, noon, and night. Come over with a bit of meat." "I'll come," Bale called back, and in a few hours' time he was down in Tuna with an elk under each arm. The following morning Bale in Balbo stood on a hill in Borgjo and called, "Red Fellow, are you awake?" "The sun and I wake together," answered Starkad. "And how goes it with you?" "Alas, I have nothing to eat but meat. Elk in the morning, elk at noon, and elk at night. Come over and bring a fish-tail along with you." "I'm coming," called out Starkad. And in a short time He had joined his friend with a barrel of salmon under each arm. In this fashion the two friends provided themselves with all the game to be found in the woods and in the water, and spread terror and destruction throughout the countryside. But one evening, when they were just returning to the sea from an excursion, a black cloud came up, and a tempest broke. They hurried along as fast as they could, but got no further than Vatrom, where a flash of lightning struck Starkad and flung him to the ground. His friend and companion-at-arms buried him beneath a stone cairn, about which he set 5 rocks, 2 at his feet, 2 at his shoulders, and 1 at his head. And that grave, measuring 20 ells in length, may still be seen near the river. The Werewolf. Once upon a time there was a king who reigned over a great kingdom. He had a queen, but only a single daughter, a girl. In consequence, the little girl was the apple of her parents' eyes. They loved her above everything else in the world, and their dearest thought was the pleasure they would take in her when she was older. But the unexpected often happens, for before the king's daughter began to grow up, the queen, her mother, fell ill and died. It is not hard to imagine the grief that reigned, not alone in the royal castle, but throughout the land, for the queen had been beloved of all. The king grieved so that he would not marry again, and his one joy was the little princess. A long time passed, and with each succeeding day the king's daughter grew taller and more beautiful, and her father granted her every wish. Now there were a number of women who had nothing to do but wait on the princess and carry out her commands. Among them was a woman who had formerly married and had 2 daughters. She had an engaging appearance, a smooth tongue, and a winning way of talking, and she was as soft and pliable as silk. But at heart she was full of machinations and falseness. Now when the queen died, she at once began to plan how she might marry the king, so that her daughters might be kept like royal princesses. With this end in view, she drew the young princess to her, paid her the most fulsome compliments on everything she said and did, and was forever bringing the conversation around to how happy she would be were the king to take another wife. There was much said on this head, early and late, and before very long the princess came to believe that the woman knew all there was to know about everything. So she asked her what sort of a woman the king ought to choose for a wife. The woman answered as sweet as honey, "It is not my affair to give advice in this matter, yet he should choose for queen someone who is kind to the little princess. For one thing I know, and that is, were I fortunate enough to be chosen, my one thought would be to do all I could for the little princess, and if she wished to wash her hands, one of my daughters would have to hold the wash bowl, and the other hand her the towel. This and much more she told the king's daughter, and the princess believed it, as children will." From that day forward, the princess gave her father no peace, and begged him again and again to marry the good court lady. Yet he did not want to marry her. But the king's daughter gave him no rest, but urged him again and again, as the false court lady had persuaded her to do. Finally, one day, when she again brought up the matter, the king cried, "I can see you will end by having your own way about this, even though it be entirely against my will. But I will do so only on one condition." "What is the condition?" asked the princess. "If I marry again," said the king, "it is only because of your ceaseless pleading. Therefore you must promise that, if in the future you are not satisfied with your stepmother or your stepsisters, not a single lament or complaint on your part reaches my ears." "This," she promised the king, and it was agreed that he should marry the court lady and make her queen of the whole country. As time passed on, the king's daughter had grown to be the most beautiful maiden to be found far and wide. The queen's daughters, on the other hand, were homely, evil of disposition, and no one knew any good of them. Hence, it was not surprising that many youths came from east and west to sue for the princess's hand, but that none of them took any interest in the queen's daughters. This made the stepmother very angry, but she concealed her rage and was as sweet and friendly as ever. Among the wooers was a king's son from another country. He was young and brave, and since he loved the princess dearly, she accepted his proposal, and they plighted their troth. The queen observed this with an angry eye, for it would have pleased her had the prince chosen one of her own daughters. She therefore made up her mind that the young pair should never be happy together, and from that time on thought only of how she might part them from each other. An opportunity soon offered itself. News came that the enemy had entered the land, and the king was compelled to go to war. Now, the princess began to find out the kind of stepmother she had, for no sooner had the king departed than the queen showed her true nature, and was just as harsh and unkind as she formerly had pretended to be, friendly and obliging. Not a day went by without her scolding and threatening the princess, and the queen's daughters were every bit as malicious as their mother. But the king's son, the lover of the princess, found himself in even worse position. He had gone hunting one day, had lost his way, and could not find his people. Then the queen used her black arts and turned him into a werewolf, to wander through the forest for the remainder of his life in that shape. When evening came and there was no sign of the prince, his people returned home, and one can imagine what sorrow they caused when the princess learned how the hunt had ended. She grieved, wept day and night, and was not to be consoled. But the queen laughed at her grief, and her heart was filled with joy to think that all had turned out exactly as she wished. Now it chanced one day, as the king's daughter was sitting alone in her room, that she thought she would go herself into the forest where the prince had disappeared. She went to her stepmother and begged permission to go out into the forest in order to forget her surpassing grief. The queen did not want to grant her request, for she always preferred saying no to yes. But the princess begged her so winningly that at last she was unable to say no, and she ordered one of her daughters to go along with her and watch her. That caused a great deal of discussion, for neither of the stepdaughters wanted to go with her. Each made all sorts of excuses, and asked what pleasures were there in going with the king's daughter, who did nothing but cry. But the queen had the last word in the end, and ordered that one of her daughters must accompany the princess, even though it be against her will. So the girls wandered out of the castle into the forest. The king's daughter walked among the trees, and listened to the song of the birds, and thought of her lover, for whom she longed, and who was now no longer there. And the queen's daughter followed her, vexed in her malice, with the king's daughter and her sorrow. After they had walked a while, they came to a little hut, lying deep in the dark forest. By then the king's daughter was very thirsty, and wanted to go into the little hut with her stepsister in order to get a drink of water. But the queen's daughter was much annoyed and said, "Is it not enough for me to be running around here in the wilderness with you? Now you even want me, who am a princess, to enter that wretched little hut. No, I will not step a foot over the threshold. If you want to go in, why go in alone?" The king's daughter lost no time, but did as her stepsister advised, and stepped into the little hut. When she entered, she saw an old woman sitting there on a bench, so enfeebled by age that her head shook. The princess spoke to her in her usual friendly way. "Good evening, motherkin. May I ask you for a drink of water?" "You are heartily welcome to it," said the old woman. "Who may you be, that step beneath my lowly roof and greet me in so winning a way?" The king's daughter told her who she was, and that she had gone out to relieve her heart in order to forget her great grief. "And what may your great grief be?" asked the old woman. "No doubt it is my fate to grieve," said the princess, "and I can never be happy again. I have lost my only love, and God alone knows whether I shall ever see him again." And she also told her why it was, and the tears ran down her cheeks in streams, so that anyone would have felt sorry for her. When she had ended, the old woman said, "You did well in confiding your sorrow to me. I have lived long and may be able to give you a bit of good advice. When you leave here, you will see a lily growing from the ground. This lily is not like other lilies, however, but has many strange virtues. Run quickly over to it and pick it. If you can do that, then you need not worry, for then one will appear who will tell you what to do." Then they parted, and the king's daughter thanked her and went her way, while the old woman sat on the bench and wagged her head. But the queen's daughter had been standing without the hut the entire time, vexing herself, and grumbling because the king's daughter had taken so long. So when the latter stepped out, she had to listen to all sorts of abuse from her stepsister, as was to be expected. Yet she paid no attention to her, and thought only of how she might find the flower of which the old woman had spoken. They went through the forest, and suddenly she saw a beautiful white lily growing in their very path. She was much pleased, and ran up at once to pick it, but that very moment it disappeared and reappeared somewhat further away. The king's daughter was now filled with eagerness, no longer listened to her stepsister's calls, and kept right on running. Yet each time when she stooped to pick the lily, it suddenly disappeared and reappeared somewhat further away. Thus it went for some time, and the princess was drawn further and further into the deep forest. But the lily continued to stand and disappear and move further away, and each time the flower seemed larger and more beautiful than before. At length the princess came to a high hill, and as she looked toward its summit, there stood the lily high on the naked rock, glittering as white and radiant as the brightest star. The king's daughter now began to climb the hill, and in her eagerness she paid no attention to stones nor steepness. And when at last she reached the summit of the hill, lo and behold, the lily no longer evaded her grasp, but remained where it was, and the princess stooped and picked it and hid it in her bosom. And so heartfelt was her happiness that she forgot her stepsisters and everything else in the world. For a long time she did not tire of looking at the beautiful flower. Then she suddenly began to wonder what her stepmother would say when she came home after having remained out so long. And she looked around in order to find the way back to the castle. But as she looked around, behold, the sun had set, and no more than a little strip of daylight rested on the summit of the hill. Below her lay the forest, so dark and shadowed that she had no faith in her ability to find the homeward path. And now she grew very sad, for she could think of nothing better to do than to spend the night on the hilltop. She seated herself on the rock, put her hand to her cheek, cried, and thought of her unkind step-mother and step-sisters, and of all the harsh words she would have to endure when she returned. And she thought of her father, the king, who was away at war, and of the love of her heart, whom she would never see again, and she grieved so bitterly that she did not even know she wept. Night came and darkness, and the stars rose, and still the princess sat in the same spot and wept. And while she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard a voice say, "Good evening, lovely maiden. Why do you sit here so sad and lonely?" She stood up hastily and felt much embarrassed, which was not surprising. When she looked around, there was nothing to be seen but a tiny old man, who nodded to her and seemed to be very humble. She answered, "Yes, it is no doubt my fate to grieve and never be happy again. I have lost my dearest love, and now I have lost my way in the forest, and am afraid of being devoured by wild beasts." "As to that," said the old man, "you need have no fear. If you will do exactly as I say, I will help you." This made the princess happy, for she felt that all the rest of the world had abandoned her. Then the old man drew out flint and steel and said, "Lovely maiden, you must first build a fire." She did as he told her, gathered moss, brush, and dry sticks, struck sparks, and lit such a fire on the hilltop that the flame blazed up to the skies. That done, the old man said, "Go on a bit, and you will find a kettle of tar, and bring the kettle to me." This the king's daughter did. The old man continued, "Now put the kettle on the fire." And the princess did that as well. When the tar began to boil, the old man said, "Now throw your white lily into the kettle." The princess thought this a harsh command, and earnestly begged to be allowed to keep the lily. But the old man said, "Did you not promise to obey my every command? Do as I tell you, or you will regret it." The king's daughter turned away her eyes, and threw the lily into the boiling tar. But it was altogether against her will, so fond had she grown of the beautiful flower. The moment she did so, a hollow roar, like that of some wild beast, sounded from the forest. It came nearer and turned into such a terrible howling that all the surrounding hills re-echoed it. Finally, there was a cracking and breaking among the trees. The bushes were thrust aside, and the princess saw a great grey wolf come running out of the forest and straight up the hill. She was much frightened, and would gladly have run away, had she been able. But the old man said, "Make haste, run to the edge of the hill, and the moment the wolf comes along, upset the kettle on him." The princess was terrified, and hardly knew what she was about. Yet she did as the old man said, took the kettle, ran to the edge of the hill, and poured its contents over the wolf, just as he was about to run up. And then a strange thing happened. No sooner had she done so than the wolf was transformed, cast off his thick grey pelt, and in place of the horrible wild beast there stood a handsome young man, looking up to the hill. And when the king's daughter collected herself and looked at him, she saw that it was really and truly her lover, who had been turned into a werewolf. It is easy to imagine how the princess felt. She opened her arms and could neither ask questions nor reply to them, so moved and delighted was she. But the prince ran hastily up the hill, embraced her tenderly, and thanked her for delivering him. Nor did he forget the little old man, but thanked him with many civil expressions for his powerful aid. Then they sat down together on the hilltop and had a pleasant talk. The prince told how he had been turned into a wolf, and of all he had suffered while running about in the forest, and the princess told of her grief, and the many tears she had shed while he had been gone. So they sat the whole night through, and never noticed it until the stars grew pale and it was light enough to see. When the sun rose, they saw that a broad path led from the hilltop straight to the royal castle, for they had a view of the whole surrounding country from the hilltop. Then the old man said, "Lovely maiden, turn around. Do you see anything out yonder?" "Yes," said the princess. "I see a horseman on a foaming horse, riding as fast as he can." Then the old man said, "He is a messenger sent on ahead by the king. Your father with all his army is following him." That pleased the princess above all things, and she wanted to descend the hill at once to meet her father. But the old man detained her and said, "Wait a while, it is too early yet. Let us wait and see how everything turns out." Time passed, and the sun was shining brightly, and its rays fell straight on the royal castle down below. Then the old man said, "Lovely maiden, turn around. Do you see anything down below?" "Yes," replied the princess. "I see a number of people coming out of my father's castle, and some are going along the road, and others into the forest." The old man said, "Those are your stepmother's servants. She has sent some to meet the king and welcome him, but she has sent others to the forest to look for you." At these words the princess grew uneasy and wished to go down to the queen's servants. But the old man withheld her and said, "Wait a while, and let us first see how everything turns out." More time passed, and the king's daughter was still looking down the road from which the king would appear, when the old man said, "Lovely maiden, turn around. Do you see anything down below?" "Yes," answered the princess. "There is a great commotion in my father's castle, and they are hanging it with black." The old man said, "That is your step-mother and her people. They would assure your father that you are dead." Then the king's daughter felt bitter anguish, and she implored from the depths of her heart, "Let me go, so that I may spare my father this anguish." But the old man detained her and said, "No, wait, it is still too early. Let us first see how everything turns out." Again time passed. The sun lay high above the fields, and the warm air blew over meadow and forest. The royal maid and youth still sat on the hilltop with the old man, where we had left them. Then they saw a little cloud rise against the horizon, far away in the distance, and the little cloud grew larger and larger, and came nearer and nearer along the road. And as it moved, one could see it was agleam with weapons, and nodding helmets, and waving flags. One could hear the rattle of swords, and the neighing of horses, and finally recognize the banner of the king. It is not hard to imagine how pleased the king's daughter was, and how she insisted on going down and greeting her father. But the old man held her back and said, "Lovely maiden, turn around. Do you see anything happening at the castle?" "Yes," answered the princess. "I can see my stepmother and stepsisters coming out, dressed in mourning, holding white kerchiefs to their faces and weeping bitterly." The old man answered, "Now they are pretending to weep because of your death. Wait just a little while longer. We have not yet seen how everything will turn out." After a time the old man said again, "Lovely maiden, turn around. Do you see anything down below?" "Yes," said the princess. "I see people bringing a black coffin now. My father is having it opened. Look, the queen and her daughters are down on their knees, and my father is threatening them with his sword." Then the old man said, "Your father wished to see your body, and so your evil stepmother had to confess the truth." When the princess heard that, she said earnestly, let me go, so that I may comfort my father in his great sorrow." But the old man held her back and said, "Take my advice and stay here a little while longer. We have not yet seen how everything will turn out." Again time went by, and the king's daughter and the prince and the old man were still sitting on the hilltop. Then the old man said, "Lovely maiden, turn around. Do you see anything down below?" "Yes," answered the princess. "I see my father and my stepsisters and my stepmother with all their following moving this way." The old man said, "Now they have started out to look for you. Go down and bring up the wolf's pelt in the gorge." The king's daughter did as he told her. The old man continued, "Now stand at the edge of the hill." And the princess did that too. Now one could see the queen and her daughters coming along the way and stopping just below the hill. Then the old man said, "Now throw down the wolf's pelt." The princess obeyed him and threw down the wolf's pelt according to his command. It fell directly on the evil queen and her daughters. And then a most wonderful thing happened. No sooner had the pelt touched the three evil women than they immediately changed shape, and turning into three horrible werewolves, they ran away as fast as they could into the forest, howling dreadfully. No more had this happened than the king himself arrived at the foot of the hill with his whole retinue. When he looked up and recognized the princess, he could not at first believe his eyes, but stood motionless, thinking her a vision. Then the old man cried, "Lovely maiden, now hasten, run down and make your father happy." There was no need to tell the princess twice. She took her lover by the hand, and they ran down the hill. When they came to the king, The princess ran on ahead, fell on her father's neck, and wept with joy. And the young prince wept as well, and the king himself wept, and their meeting was a pleasant sight for everyone. There was great joy and many embraces, and the princess told of her evil step-mother and step-sisters, and of her lover, and all that she had suffered, and of the old man who had helped them in such a wonderful way. But when the king turned around to thank the old man, he had completely vanished, and from that day on no one could say who he had been or what had become of him. The king and his whole retinue now returned to the castle, where the king had a splendid banquet prepared, to which he invited all the able and distinguished people throughout the kingdom, and bestowed his daughter on the young prince. And the wedding was celebrated with gladness and music and amusements of every kind for many days. I was there too, and when I rode through the forest, I met a wolf with 2 young wolves, and they showed me their teeth and seemed very angry. And I was told they were none other than the evil step-mother and her 2 daughters. Once upon a time there was a king who had a 3-year-old son and was obliged to go to war against another king. Then, when his ship sailed home again after he had gained a splendid victory, a storm broke out and his whole fleet was near sinking. But the king vowed he would sacrifice to the sea queen the first male creature that came to meet him when he reached land and entered his capital. Thereby the whole fleet reached the harbour in safety. But the 5-year-old prince, who had not seen his father for the past 2 years, and who was delighted with the thunder of the cannon as the ships came in, secretly slipped away from his attendants and ran to the landing. And when the king came ashore, he was the first to cast himself into his arms, weeping with joy. The king was frightened when he thought of the sea queen, but he thought that, after all, the prince was only a child, and at any rate he could sacrifice the next person to step up to him after the prince. But from that time on, no one could make a successful sea trip, and the people began to murmur because the king had not kept the promise he had made the sea queen. But the king and queen never allowed the prince out without a great escort, and he was never permitted to enter a ship for all his desire to do so. After a few years, they gradually forgot the sea queen, and when the prince was 10 years old, a little brother came to join him. Not long after, the older of the princes was out walking with his tutor and several other gentlemen, and when they reached the end of the royal gardens by the seashore, it was a summer's day. Unusually clear, they were suddenly enveloped by a thick cloud, which disappeared as swiftly as it had come. And when it vanished, the prince was no longer there, nor did he return, to the great sorrow of the king, the queen, and the whole country. In the meantime, the young prince, who was now the sole heir to the crown and kingdom, grew up, and when he was 16, they began to think of finding a wife for him. For the old king and queen wished to see him marry the daughter of some powerful monarch to whom they were allied, before they died. With this in view, letters were written and embassies sent out to the most distant countries. While these negotiations were being conducted, it began to be said that the seashore was haunted. Various people had heard cries, and several who had walked by the seashore late in the evening had fallen ill. At length, no one ventured to go there after 11 at night, because a voice kept crying from out at sea, "First born, first wed." And when someone did venture nearer, he did so at the risk of his life. At last these complaints came to the king's ear. He called together his council, and it was decided to question a wise woman, who had already foretold many mysterious happenings, which had all taken place exactly as she had said they would. When the wise woman was brought before the king, she said it was the prince who had been taken into the sea, who was calling, and that they would have to find him a bride, young, beautiful, and belonging to one of the noblest families of the land, and she must be no less than 15 and no more than 17 years old. That seemed a serious difficulty, for no one wished to give their daughter to a sea-king. Yet, when there was no end to the cries and the commotion, the wise woman said, "That first, it might be well to build a little house by the sea. Perhaps then the turmoil might die away. At any rate," she said, "no phantoms would haunt the place while the building was in progress. Hence, no more than 4 workmen need be employed, and they might first prepare a site, then lay the stone foundation, and finally erect the small house, comprising no more than 2 pleasant, handsome rooms, one behind the other, and a good floor." The house was carefully erected, and the royal architect himself had to superintend the work, so that everything might be done as well as possible. And while the building was going on, there were no mysterious noises, and everyone could travel peacefully along the seashore. For that reason, the 4 workmen did not hurry with their work, yet not one of them could stay away for a day, because when they did, the tumult along the shore would begin again, and one could hear the cries, "First born, first wed." When the little house was finally completed, the best carpenters came and worked in it, then painters and other craftsmen, and at last it was furnished, because when the work stopped for no more than a single day, the cries were heard again by night. The rooms were fitted out as sumptuously as possible, and a great mirror was hung in the drawing-room. According to the instructions of the wise woman, it was hung in such wise that from the bed in the bedroom, even though one's face were turned to the wall, one could still see who stepped over the threshold into the drawing-room, for the door between each room was always to stand open. When all was finished, and the little house had been arranged with regal splendor, the cries of "First born, first wed" again began to sound from the shore. And it was found necessary, though all were unwilling, to follow the wise woman's counsel, and choose 3 of the loveliest maidens between the ages of 15 and 17, belonging to the first families of the land. They were to be taken to the castle, said the wise woman, and to be treated like ladies of the blood royal, and one after another they were to be sent to the little house by the seashore, for should one of them find favour in the eyes of the sea prince, then the commotion and turmoil would surely cease. In the meantime, the negotiations for the marriage of the younger prince were continued, and the bride selected for him was soon expected to arrive. So the girls were also chosen for the sea prince. The 3 chosen, as well as their parents, were quite inconsolable over their fate. Even the fact that they were to be treated like princesses did not console them. Yet had they not yielded, it would have been all the worse for them and for the whole land. The first girl destined to sleep in the sea palace was the oldest, and when she sought out the wise woman and asked her advice, the latter said she should lie down in the handsome bed, but should turn her face to the wall, and under no circumstances turn around curiously, and try and see what was going on. She had only the right to behold what she saw reflected in the mirror in the drawing-room as she lay with her face to the wall. At 10 o'clock that night, the royal sea bride was led with great pomp to the little house. Her relatives and the court said farewell to her with many tears, left her before 11, locked the door on the outside, and took the keys with them to the castle. The wise woman was also there, consoled the people, and assured them that if the maiden only forbore to speak, and did not turn around, she would come out in the morning fresh and blooming. The poor girl prayed and wept until she grew sleepy, but toward 12 o'clock the outer door suddenly opened, and then the door of the drawing-room. She was startled and filled with fear when, her face turned toward the wall, she saw in the great mirror how a tall, well-built youth entered, from whose garments the water ran in streams to the floor. He shook himself as though freezing, and said, "Oh, ho!" Then he went to the window, and there laid down an unusually large and handsome apple, and hung a bottle in the casement. Next he stepped to the bed, bent over the sleeping girl and looked at her, strode up and down a few times, shaking the water from his clothes and saying, "Oh!" Then he went back to the bed, undressed hurriedly, lay down and fell asleep. The poor girl had not been sleeping, but had only closed her eyes when the prince bent over her. Now she was glad to think he was fast asleep, and forgot the wise woman's warning not to turn around. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she wanted to find out if this were a real human being. She turned around softly, lest she wake him, but just as she sat up quietly in bed in order to take a good look at her neighbor, he swiftly seized her right hand, hewed it off, and flung it under the bed. Then he at once lay down and fell asleep again. As soon as it was day, he rose, dressed without casting even a glance at the bed, took the bottle and the apple from the window, went hastily out, and locked the door after him. One can imagine how the poor girl suffered in the meantime, and when her friends and relatives came to fetch her, they found her weeping and robbed of her hand. She was brought to the castle, and the wise woman sent for and overwhelmed with bitter reproaches. But she said that if the maiden had not turned around and had overcome her curiosity, she would not have lost her hand. They were to treat her as though she were really and truly a princess, but that it would be as much as her life were worth to allow her to return to the neighborhood of the little house. The two girls were all the more discouraged by this mishap, and thought themselves condemned to death, though the wise woman consoled them as well as she knew how. The second promised her faithfully not to turn around, yet it happened with her as it had with the first. The prince came in at 12 o'clock, dripping, shook himself so that the water flew about, said, "Aha!" went to the window, laid down the beautiful apple, hung up the bottle, came into the bedroom, bent over the bed, strode up and down a few times, said, "Ah, oh," hastily undressed, and at once fell asleep. Her curiosity gained the upper hand, and when she made sure that he was sleeping soundly, she carefully turned around in order to look at him. But he seized her right hand, hewed it off, and cast it under the bed, and then laid down again and slept on. At dawn he rose, dressed without casting a glance at the bed, took the apple and the bottle, went out and locked the door after him. When her friends and relatives came to fetch the girl in the morning, they found her weeping and without a right hand. She was taken to the castle, where she found herself just as little welcome as her predecessor, and the wise woman insisted that the girl must have turned around, though at first she denied it absolutely. Then the youngest, sweetest and loveliest of the three maidens had to go to the sea castle amid the mourning of the entire court. The wise woman accompanied her, and implored her not to turn around, since there was no other means of protection against the spell. The maiden promised to heed her warning, and said that she would pray God to help her if she were plagued with curiosity. All happened as before. The prince came on the stroke of 12, dripping wet, said, "Aha!" shook himself, laid the apple on the window, hung up the bottle, went into the bedroom, bent over the bed, strode up and down for a few times, said, "Aha!" undressed, and at once fell asleep. The poor girl was half dead with fear and terror, and prayed and struggled against her curiosity, till at length she fell asleep, and did not awake until the prince rose and dressed. He stepped up to the bed, bent over it for a moment, went out, turned at the door, and took the bottle and the apple, and then locked the door after him. In the morning, the entire court, the girl's parents and the wise woman came to fetch her. She came to meet them weeping with joy, and was conducted to the castle in triumph, and with joy indescribable. The king and queen embraced her, and she was paid the same honors destined for the princess who was to arrive in the course of the next few days to marry the heir to the throne. Now the maiden had to sleep every night in the little house by the strand, and every evening the prince came in with his apple and his bottle, and every morning went away at dawn. But it seemed to her that each succeeding evening and morning he looked at her a little longer, though she, always silent, timid, and turned toward the wall, did not dare see more than her mirror showed her of his coming and going. But the two other girls who had lost their hands, and who now no longer lived in the castle, were jealous of the honor shown the youngest, and threatened to have her done away with if she did not restore their hands. The maiden went weeping to the wise woman, and the latter said that when the prince had lain down as usual, she should say, keeping her face turned toward the wall, "The maidens twain will see me slain, or else have back their hands again." But she was to offer no further information nor say another word. With a beating heart, the poor girl waited until the prince came, and when he had bent over the bed longer than usual, sighed, then hastily undressed and lain down, the maiden said, quivering and trembling, "The maidens twain will see me slain, or else have back their hands again." The prince at once replied, "Take the hands, they are lying under the bed, and the bottle hanging in the window, and pour some of the contents of the bottle on their arms and hands. Join them together, bind them up, take away the bandages in 3 days. Time and the hands will have been healed." The maiden made no reply, and fell asleep. In the morning the prince rose as usual, stepped over to the bed several times, and looked at her from its foot. But she did not dare look up, and closed her eyes. He sighed, took his apple, but left the bottle and went. When the maiden rose, she did as he had told her, and in 3 days' time removed the bandages and the girls. Hands were well and whole. Now the foreign princess arrived, and the wedding was to be celebrated as soon as possible. Yet she was not fitted out with any more magnificence than the bride of the sea prince, and both were equally honored by the king and court. This annoyed the two other girls, and they again threatened to have the youngest done away with if she did not let them taste the apple which the prince always brought with him. Again the maiden sought the advice of the wise woman, in whom she had confidence. And that night, when the prince had lain down, she said, "The maidens twain will see me slain, or else your apple they would gain." Then the prince said, "Take the apple lying in the window, and when you go out, lay it on the ground, and follow wherever it may roll. And when it stops, pick as many apples as you wish, and return the same way you came." The maiden made no reply, and fell asleep. On the following morning it seemed harder than ever for the prince to resolve to go away. He appeared excited and restless, sighed often, bent over the maiden several times, went into the living room, then turned around and looked at her once more. Finally, when the sun rose, he hurried out and locked the door after him. When the maiden rose, she could not help weeping, for she had really begun to love the prince. Then she took the apple, and when she was outside the door, laid it on the ground, and it rolled and rolled, and she followed it a long, long way to a region unknown to her. There she came to a high garden wall, over which hung the branches of trees, loaded with beautiful fruit. Finally she reached a great portal, adorned with gold and splendid ornaments, which opened of its own accord as the apple rolled up to it. And the apple rolled through the portal, and the maiden followed it into the garden, which was the most beautiful she ever had seen. The apple rode over to a low-growing tree weighed with the most magnificent apples, and there it stopped. The maiden picked all that her silken apron would hold, and turned to see from which direction she had come, and where the portal stood through which she would have to pass on her way back. But the garden was so lovely that she felt like enjoying its charms a while longer, and without thinking of the prince's words, she touched the apple with her foot, and it began to roll again. Suddenly, the portal closed with a great crash. Then the maiden was much frightened and regretted having done what had been forbidden her. Yet now she could not get out and was compelled to follow the apple once more. It rolled far into the beautiful garden and stopped at a little fireplace where stood 2 kettles of water, one small, the other large. There was a great fire burning under the large kettle, but only a weak fire beneath the smaller one. Now, when the apple stopped there, the maiden did not know what to do. Then it occurred to her to scrape away the fire beneath the large kettle and thrust it under the little one. And soon the kettle over the small fire began to boil, and the kettle over the large one simmered down. But she could not stay there, and since she had already disobeyed the order given her, she expected to die, nothing less, and was quite resigned to do so, because she had lost all hope of winning the prince. So she gave the apple another push, and it rolled into a meadow in the middle of the garden, and there lay 2 little children, asleep, with the hot sun beating straight down upon them. The maiden felt sorry for the children, and she took her apron and laid it over them to protect them from the sun, and only kept the apples she could put in her little basket. But she could not stay here either, so again she touched the apple, and it rolled on, and before she knew it, the girl found herself by the seashore. There, under a shady tree, lay the prince asleep, while beside him sat the sea queen. Both rose when the maiden drew near, and the prince looked at her with alarm and tenderness in his flashing eyes. Then he leaped into the sea, and the white foam closed over him. But the sea queen was enraged and seized the girl, who thought that her last moment had struck, and begged for a merciful death. The sea queen looked at her and asked her who had given her permission to pass beyond the apple tree. The maiden confessed her disobedience and said that she had done so without meaning any harm, whereupon the sea queen said she would see how she had conducted herself and punish her accordingly. Thereupon the sea queen gave the apple a push, and it rolled back through the portal to the apple tree. The sea queen saw that the apple tree was uninjured, again pushed the apple, and it rolled on to the little fireplace. But when the sea queen saw the small kettle boiling furiously, while the large one was growing cold, she became very angry, seized the girl's arms savagely, and rising to her full height, asked, "What have you dared do here? How dared you take the fire from under my kettle and put it under your own?" The maiden did not know that she had done anything wrong, and said that she did not know why. Then the sea queen replied, "The large kettle signified the love between the prince and myself, the small one, the love between the prince and you. Since you have taken the fire from under my kettle and laid it under your own, the prince is now violently in love with you, while his love for me is well nigh extinguished. Look," she cried angrily, "now my kettle has stopped boiling altogether, and yours is boiling over. But I will see what other harm you have done and punish you accordingly." And the sea queen again pushed the apple with her foot, and it rolled to the sleeping children, who had been covered with the apron. Then the sea queen said, "Did you do that?" "Yes," replied the maiden, weeping, "but I meant no harm. I covered the little ones with my apron so that the sun might not burn down on them so fiercely, and I left with them the apples I could not put in my basket." The sea queen said, "This deed and your truthfulness are your salvation. I see that you have a kind heart. These children belong to me and to the prince, but since he now loves you more than he does me, I will resign him to you. Go back to the castle, and there say what I tell you, that your wedding with my prince is to be celebrated at the same time as that of his younger brother, and all your jewels, your ornaments, your wedding dress, and your bridal chair are to be exactly like those of the other princess, from the moment on that the priest blesses the prince and yourself. I have no further power over him, but since I have seen to it that he has all the qualities which adorn a ruler, I demand that he be made the heir to his father's kingdom. for he is the oldest son. The younger prince may rule over the kingdom which his bride brings him. All this you must tell them, for only under these conditions will I release the prince. And when you are arrayed in your bridal finery, come to me here, without anyone's knowledge, so that I may see how they have adorned you. Here is the apple which will show you the way without anyone being able to tell where you go." With that, the Sea Queen parted from her and gave the apple a push. It rolled out of the garden and to the castle, where the maiden, with mingled joy and terror, delivered the Sea Queen's message to the king and told him what she demanded for the prince. The king gladly promised all that was desired, and great preparations were at once made for the double wedding. 2 bridal chairs were set up side by side, 2 wedding gowns, and 2 sets of jewels exactly similar were made ready. When the maiden had been dressed in her bridal finery, she pretended to have forgotten something, which she had to fetch from a lower floor, went downstairs with her apple, and laid it on the ground. It at once rolled to the spot by the seashore where she had found the Sea Queen and the prince, and where the Sea Queen was now awaiting her. "It is well that you have come," said the Sea Queen, "for the slightest disobedience would have meant misfortune for you. But how do you look? Are you dressed just as the princess is? And has the princess no better clothes or jewels?" The maiden answered timidly that they were dressed exactly alike. Then the Sea Queen tore her gown from her body, unclasped the jewels from her hair, and flinging them on the ground, cried, "Is that the way the bride of my prince should look? Since I have given him to you, I will give you my bridal outfit as well." And with that, she raised up a sod beneath the great tree, and a shrine adorned with gold and precious stones appeared, from which she drew out her bridal outfit, which fitted the maiden as though made for her. And it was so costly and so covered with gems that the maiden was almost blinded by its radiance. The crown, too, glowed with light, and was set with the most wonderful emeralds, and all was magnificent beyond what any princess had ever worn. "Now," said the Sea Queen, when she had finished adorning the maiden, "now go back to the castle, and show them how I was dressed when I wedded the prince. All this I give as a free gift to you and your descendants. But you must always conduct yourself so that the prince will be content with you, and you must make his happiness your first thought all your life long." This the maiden promised, with honest tears, and the Sea Queen bade her go. When she was again in the castle, all were astonished at the beauty and costliness of her dress and jewels, in comparison to which those of the other princess were as nothing. The treasures of the whole kingdom would not have sufficed to pay for such a bridal outfit, and none any longer dared envy the lovely maiden, for never had a princess brought a richer bridal dower into the country. Now all went in solemn procession to the church, and the priests stood before the bridal chairs with their books open and waited for the prince who, according to the Sea Queen's word, would not come until the blessing was to be spoken. They waited impatiently, and the king finally told one of the greatest nobles to seat himself in the bridal chair in the prince's place, which he did. But the very moment the priest began to pray, the 2 wings of the church portal quickly flew open, and a tall, strong, handsome man with flashing eyes, royally clad, came in, stepped up to the bridal chair, thrust his proxy out so hastily that he nearly fell, and cried, "This is my place. Now, priest, speak the blessing." While the blessing was spoken, the prince became quiet again, and then greeted his parents and the whole court with joy, and before all embraced his wife, who now for the first time ventured to take a good look at him. Thenceforward the prince was like any other human being, and in the end he inherited his father's kingdom, and became a great and world-renowned ruler, beloved by his subjects and adored by his wife. They lived long and happily, and their descendants are still the rulers of the land over which he reigned.